should have started by saying this, and you were talking about this, that the Milwaukee Brewers originally were the St. Louis Browns turned Baltimore Orioles, and I didn't even know that the Brewers were an original American League team.
I think that's a really weird way of putting it because it's kind of confusing.
1 year.
I think a better way of putting it is the Baltimore Orioles technically started as the Milwaukee Brewers, playing 1 year, I think, in like 1900 or something.
01, original team in the American League.
And then that team went away for a few years until I guess what I can only assume is the same ownership group showed up in Baltimore as the Baltimore Braves.
So the St. Louis Browns, who were the bottom of the league for so many years, we'll talk about that a little bit, went in 1902, the year after they left Milwaukee, and they were there until 1953. So they were there for 50 years of really lousy baseball. In fact, their winning percentage was .433, so they were 3,414 wins and 4,465 losses. That is as bad as any team we've talked about. So were they there,
and they were there at the same time the Cardinals were there?
That's right.
So there was two teams in St. Louis that whole time.
Right. And in fact, what do they call it? The Streetcar World Series of 1944 was between the Browns and the Cardinals.
Okay, so I'm guessing that when the Browns left to go to Baltimore, that's why we got a Kansas City team shortly thereafter.
Right, so exactly, because the A's left Philadelphia and went to Kansas City in 1953, and they were there till 1965. So you're right to be on Milwaukee, moved from Boston, the Boston Braves or Bees. We've talked about that. So all that was going on, in the early. That was to be sort of like the beginning of like moving teams around, regularly.
What we saw through like the 50s into the 60s until we sort of have what we've kind of had since then, which is the current landscape of the Major League Baseball, just with the expansion teams added in.
And so the Orioles, were lucky that, they were able to get rid of everybody's memory of what the Browns were, because the Browns never won a championship in the 50.
Well, I think the name change certainly helps, because I don't think of them as the same franchise. To me, I mean, if you asked me when the Orioles started before we started research for this episode, I would have guessed, weren't they one of the original teams?
Well,
it feels like it.
Yeah. Well, when you pointed out, look, when you've been around for 80 years, to a lot of people, that's forever.
Right, exactly. For the average baseball fan today, there's only ever been Major League Baseball with the Baltimore Orioles around, so it's not surprising that they kind of feel like a team that's been there, the whole time.
And I could have looked at this more. I assume the Browns tried to get new ballparks built. They played in Sportsman's Park in St. Louis, but they were always the second-class citizen as long as the Cardinals.
The Cardinals were always, number one in the St. Louis. And then so things were not great for, the St. Louis Browns for a very long time. But then they show up in Baltimore, and they pretty much had success right off the bat.
I don't know what year it was. Obviously I said that they went to the World Series during the war in 1944 as the Browns, which is probably the only reason they did, because a lot of the good players weren't around and they had a chance. And it was not that year. I think it was the next year in 45 where they had the one-armed ball player.
Well, they also had Eddie Veet, the shortest ball player.
No. Eddie Gadel was a Bill. It's right. That was a Bill Veeck St. Louis Browns against the White Sox.
Right. So that was the thing. So then they're also the franchise with a lot of that in their past, because you had Bill Veeck sort of just trying to make baseball into an entertainment product and doing whatever he could to get people to come to the game.
The team wasn't any good.
No. So and then they moved to Baltimore and they got good.
Right. So since they've been in Baltimore, they have, like I said, over 500 win-loss percentage, 505. And through this year, they've won 567 games and lost 59. So really, this year was a big help, because they had a very good record this year.
They needed that to probably get back up there.
They've made the playoffs 14 times in their history. And if we remember the Orioles, we could talk about some. There's a lot of playoff failures in the Orioles' history.
Well, they've got 3 World Series.
They've got 3 World Series, all since 1966.
So that's pretty good. But I think the tough thing for Oriole fans is they were all very closely grouped together.
Well, and not only that, but the greatest player in Oriole history, and I'll say it right now. I think you knew it without me even saying it because I tried to throw another name in there, and you're like, "What?" So anybody would say the great Jim Palmer is the greatest, and he pitched on all three Baltimore Oriole World Series teams, 1966,
and that's why he is in the Hall of Fame,
right? 1970 and 1983. So he didn't pitch much in 1983,
but he was there.
He was there, and he threw some innings. So and what an amazing ball player he was. And we'll talk about him specifically because there's every checkbox there is for being great.
Oh
he does that. So so they're sort of failures, and I think I remember more recently their failure had to do with I think an Armando Benitez.
Well, I thought it was more with Buck Showalter not putting in Zach Britton.
I heard Zach Britton on he just retired this week, and he was on the leadoff spot with Steve Phillips and Eduardo, or maybe with somebody else that day. Anyway, I sent a note to them going, they should really ask him, is Zach Britton more famous for the time he didn't pitch than for all the times he did?
Ultimately, that's what he'll be remembered for. And it won't even really be he'll be remembered for that. He'll just be discussed as part of that situation. But, I mean, Bill Buckner is most famous for the play he didn't make.
Yeah. Well, in this case, he didn't even get a chance to try and Zach Britton.
But it's like people don't talk about. It's not like the memory is Zach Britton wasn't able to pitch or refused to pitch. It was that Buck didn't put him in, so that doesn't really reflect poorly on him.
No, it doesn't. And he, because he's a classy guy, he said, "Look, I'm okay with what Buck did. I had pitched a lot before that game."
Right. He played it diplomatically, like he's supposed to.
He didn't kind of throw Buck under the bus and say, "Well, yeah, he should have done that." But I'm sure if they would have asked him the question the right way, he would have liked to have had a chance.
Oh
to
yeah,
pitch.
Of course he would have. He's a player.
So in that particular instance, so the Orioles have had some really great players on the pitching side of it. They've had some, Mike Mussina, Hall of Famer. I think you would say.
Well, he's not.
Oh yeah.
He's a Hall of Famer?
He's a Hall of Famer.
Oh, I'm wrong on that. I'm so sorry. I didn't think he was.
He's a Hall of Famer. And had more success with the Orioles, although he won his World Series with the Yankees. But when you start getting down to, like the other great Baltimore pitchers.
I certainly don't remember any since Mussina.
Right, like starting, and we're talking about starting pitchers. By the way, when I go later on, you try to talk about like the great relief pitchers. It's the great Baltimore relief pitchers. You're not going to remember. You're not going to believe who I picked as my number one, and it wasn't Armando Benitez.
That's going to be a problem because I don't really know another one.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, the
Zach Britton.
Zach Britton was one of the guys.
Right, like that was my other guess.
And the other guy was a guy they had on the radio also talking about there recently. So he's pitched in your lifetime.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know that. It's like it just tells you they didn't have a lot of
No, but there are positions
closers
where they did. Obviously, I think most people would know the left side of the Baltimore Oriole infield historically is up there all time in terms of strength,
led by two Hall of Famers.
Right.
In fact, I don't know that they have. Well, I'd say let's talk about it. Let's do that.
If you go around the infield, you could say leading at every position is a Hall of Famer. Because you're going to have Eddie Murphy at first base.
Eddie Murray. That would be funny, though.
It would be funny. Eddie Murray at first base. Roberto Alomar at second. Ripken at short. Brooks Robinson at third.
Right.
That's about as good as an infield about anybody outside probably the Yankees or like one of the original franchises is going to boast.
And I don't know if you know, Eddie Murray played more before you.
I'm going to tell you, I just called him Eddie Murphy. Clearly, I don't know his game.
But you know he was a Hall of Fame player.
Right, but I know just he was a guy that's got a name close to an actor, and I always confuse him.
Gold gloves, obviously at first base, which I don't think I really thought of because I just thought of him as a feared power hitter with the 500 home runs. He did play for the Dodgers and the Mets at the end of his career. At the very end of his career, and he was a switch hitter. Which I thought was pretty interesting because there are not too many power hitting first basemen
that were also switch
hitters, right? And power hitters as switch hitters in the first place. You think Mickey Mantle right away, but I don't know that people think Eddie Murray, and I think he's probably up there in the pantheon of power hitting switch hitters in the history of Major League Baseball.
Yeah, I mean, then again, that's a pretty small.
Yeah, well, it's hard to do,
right?
So and then was Alomar a switch hitter too? I think he might have been.
He might have been. I don't remember fully.
And another, amazing ball player, who, it's amazing to have 4 guys, as your best players as Hall of Famers.
Right. There's not a lot of teams that can boast that. I mean, some can, but that's more just due to longevity than anything else. If you've played for, you got a 100+ year franchise, there's a decent chance you've got a guy at one position for each place.
So, but back to the pitcher for a second. We said, I think Mussina is probably the second greatest Oriole pitcher, but you kind of that's a big drop off from Jim Palmer, although he's a Hall of Famer.
He's a Hall of Famer, so it's not that big a drop off, but most people would classify Palmer as one of the all-time greats, and I don't think Mussina quite gets that respect.
So I came up with some other great Oriole pitchers, and the problem is that unless you're a baseball nerd fan like me and you think, oh yeah, I remember Mike Flanagan, he won a Cy Young Award.
I remember Kevin Brown had a really good couple of years.
I didn't even put him in my list. That's an excellent point.
But you're talking about guys that had a stretch or a season.
Right, they weren't like Orioles for 10. Like Scott McGregor pitched for the Orioles his entire career. Really good pitcher. I think he started an all-star game. You might not have ever heard of him.
No.
Right? But a fine pitcher. Not a Hall of Fame pitcher, not even close.
They've had guys that had good seasons and got 20 wins for them. I want to say that I remember there was a year guy recently, within the last 20 years, had 20 wins for them. But it was a one-off season, right. So it's kind of hard to be oh yeah, that's somebody you're going to point to as a paragon of Oriole pitching.
And we'll talk about Frank Robinson because there's another Hall of Famer in their outfield, but he was traded for Milt Pappas from the Orioles. And, Milt Pappas, I went back and looked at his stats, and Milt Pappas won 20 games a bunch of times, was a strikeout pitcher, was just an excellent pitcher. Another guy that, so he pitched nearly 60 years ago, so you don't really follow him stuff, but, an excellent pitcher, and probably a lot of people don't even remember that he pitched for the Orioles anymore. But he was on the other end of one of the more famous trades in Major League history. And they have a Hall of Famer at catcher, too.
Really? Okay, I didn't. Who would that be?
A guy that no one thought should have been in the Hall of Fame.
No, that's never a good way to introduce him.
So his brother was supposedly the better ball player. So,
one of these.
These are the Ferrells, right? This is Rick Ferrell. And you look at his stats and you think, what were they thinking?
It's like a little poison situation.
Maybe. Well, I don't think Wes. Maybe we could look that up. I don't think Wes Ferrell, his pitcher, who was mostly known as an excellent player, who was the most handsome guy in the major leagues. You read about this guy going, okay, he's like movie star, good looks, okay, but how is he as a player?
Good enough to be a Hall of Famer, apparently.
I don't know that Wes Ferrell is in the Hall of Fame. I think his brother went in the Hall of Fame, and he didn't. But Wes was the better ball player, and he was a home run hitting pitcher, so he was a great hitter as a pitcher.
But his brother, the not as good playing catcher, got in?
That is correct. So Wes Ferrell is not in the Hall of Fame. He has a 60.1 career WAR. 193 wins, 128 losses. The guy was a great hitting pitcher. His brother, the catcher, is in the Hall of Fame.
Did they just get them confused when they were putting the ballots in?
That's a good point.
That would just be like this, and they were just way too embarrassed at that point to say anything. So they're just just go with it, okay? We'll just pretend. He's a catcher. We got to put a couple of them in.
And it's a good thing, right? Because the rest of the catchers in Oriole history, I had to dig down deep. So
I guess maybe Adley.
Well, he's only been around 2 years, but he might be the best, because if you think Rick Dempsey, who was more to me, Rick Dempsey started catcher in the 80s, was a good catcher, not a great catcher, more famous for doing dressing up in the penguin suit during rain delays and sliding into second base and doing goofy stuff like that.
I can tell you, Rick Dempsey did not have enough impact on baseball to reach me.
Yeah, to reach you. So Rick Dempsey, and one of my favorite names in baseball, wasn't a great catcher, but Andy Etchebarren was a catcher for the Orioles back in the 1960s. But the point is that
there's not a lot.
After the guy who wasn't that good is a Hall of Famer.
and you run into that in the outfield kind of interestingly as well, because you have Frank Robinson, who everybody will acknowledge is an all-time great, and then you kind of have a bunch of guys named Joe.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're not actually completely terrific ball players, but when we were talking about reaching up to the Mount Olympus of baseball players, you don't even have a Hall of Famer or a guy that you would even argue
there
is
are no
close.
Other Hall of Famers, to your point.
There's no other Hall of Famers, and I don't know if there's another guy that's close.
No, I don't think so either. I mean,
Adam Jones is an Oriole legend, but he kind of reminds me of an Andrew McCutchen, a guy that will be beloved from this era of baseball for their respective teams, but nobody's going to retire their number or say they should be in the Hall of Fame.
And so I came with a couple other names. So I watched a guy named Paul Blair play center field for the Orioles that won the championship in 70, and they played the Mets in 69. Really good defensive center fielder. Could not hit very well at all, so that takes him out of being any kind of all-time great.
Brady Anderson hit 50 home runs one season for them.
How do you think that happened?
I don't know, but I will always remember that.
And there was I looked up great Oriole players, and just because I like the name, Baby Doll Jacobson. And if you go into Baseball Reference and you write in Baby Doll Jacobson, that's the name that comes up. Just like Home Run Baker, by the way, not related with Orioles, but I was looking up, as I knew his name was Frank, so I'm looking for his career stakes, and I can't find him. No, you have to look him up as Home Run Baker.
Because that's what he was known as.
His name. That's not his name. And when he was at home, his mom would say, "Home Run, would you come here, please?" So, Ken Singleton was another outfielder. I put him as the other outfielder between. That's how far. Now, Ken Singleton was a fine Major League ball player, to your point.
But we're gonna do like that. That's already sort of pejorative against
because
it.
Not every team can have a Hall of Famer in every position.
Right. But still, we're like, oh, he's a fine baseball player.
He hit home runs. He played good defense. He was there a long time. He batted 280 or something like that for his career. I don't know. What do you want a guy to do? Either be a Hall of Famer or not.
It's just funny the way we're describing him is all.
Yeah, well, you had to come up with guys to fill out our lineup.
You are correct.
So, and Ken Williams was another old-time Oriole player that I really don't have, much knowledge of. But that's how far you have to dig down.
All right. So they're a really strong team in the infield, not so much when you get to the outfield.
And so I said the relief pitcher wasn't Zach Britton. It's not Armando Benitez. Not Jim Johnson. Wasn't he like that closer there for a while at one point? Greg Olson.
Who?
Greg Olson probably played into the 90s.
Yeah, the name sounds somewhat familiar, but that's also a common name.
Right. And so they just never had. I think Jose Mesa might have been there for a little while at one point. But to your point, they've never had a guy that sort of own that closer position and be dominant for a bunch of years. A lot of teams are like that.
Most teams are like that, I think. Closer's kind of a hard position to have because it's also a role that hasn't really existed for the entirety of baseball.
Or didn't get credited, at least, for existing, even if people were being used that way. It was hard to find relief pitchers, that go deep down, that rabbit hole. Earl Weaver is my manager.
And he's like the manager of Baltimore. He's like legendary there for a variety of reasons.
Mainly for kicking dirt on people
and winning.
So, and do you remember he was known for a bunt and a bink or something like that, like a hit and a 3-run homer. He was the proponent of thinking that 3-run homers would solve all my problems. So that's what we play for, is to get a dink and a doink and a 3-run jack, and and then we win.
Right, but if you're getting 3-run home runs, it means you got guys on base.
Yeah, and they were some really good Oriole teams, obviously, from that period.
So when did he really manage from?
60s through the 70s into, I think, I'm going to guess, and I don't remember for sure if he was the manager for the 83 Orioles, but he could have made it all the way through.
He could have done all three.
So he could have done the same thing with Jim Palmer, which
Interesting.
I would have thought about that. The Orioles also had the distinction of being a great answer to a trivia question. I don't know if they're the only franchise, because it might have happened before, but certainly the most recent franchise to have 4 20-game winners in the same season.
Wow.
Okay, which just meant those guys pitched a lot.
Something you're actually probably never going to see again.
I think it's a pretty safe bet.
Right. You may
never see a 20-game winner again.
You might see a 20-game winner just because one guy has an unbelievable year where everything breaks right for him. But I don't think you'll ever see a team with 4.
So Jim Palmer, Mike Cuellar, who was a good left-handed pitcher for a long time.
Won 20 games.
Won 20 games. Dave McNally also pitched for the Expos and was a really good pitcher for the Orioles. And the guy that always you forget in the trivia question, a guy named Pat Dobson, and I think he pitched for Cleveland before that, but that was his year.
I can't say I forgot him. I never knew he existed.
Never knew him in the first place. So yeah, the only other team that did it was the 1920 White Sox.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool distinction to have in Major League history that happened twice in 50 years almost.
And those are the only 2 times it's ever going to happen.
And it never happened again. So Jim Palmer. I just wanted to mention the 3 Cy Youngs, the 211 complete games.
It's more than guys have wins.
211 complete games. Of those, 53 were shutouts.
That's pretty good. So like 1 out of every 4.
53 shutouts.
Like 1 out of every 4.
That's crazy. He pitched the whole game 211 times, and 53 of those times he didn't give up any runs.
It's pretty good.
How can you now? Granted, Palmer pitched during that time. When he had the mound lowered,
right,
and whatnot. So it was a pitching dominant era,
but not for a long time because he pitched into the 80s and he pitched through the 70s. So he was pitching a long time where the mound wasn't like that.
So he had about half his career, one way and the other, because he came up in, I think he came up in '66.
Right.
So actually, only a couple of years.
Right. That's what I was saying.
Yeah. So he was a young pitcher, and he is their number 1 player by far in terms of WAR. We didn't talk much about Brooks Robinson. We mentioned that he was the Hall of Famer.
What else are you going to say about him?
Well, then just because he passed away recently, and there was just a lot of really nice things said about a guy that I think everybody felt was one of the most genuinely nice people you'll ever meet in baseball, and he carried that all the way to the end of his life, actually, and was very involved in the game. But Brooks Robinson, was a good player who announced himself in the 1970 World Series, not the 69 World Series against the Mets, the next year when they won against the Cincinnati Reds, because he fielded everything and anything that went up to third base and made plays that I don't think people had ever seen before. And this was at the beginning of television replay, and so that was probably one of the first times, I'm just thinking of this now as I'm saying it, where you got to see what somebody did
like live and
a million times on replay,
right,
when you could never see it at all before that.
And I'm sure that was part of the reason why his legend grew so much.
So there are not a lot of St. Louis Browns on the all-time list, and
which makes sense because we talked about how terrible they were.
But there are St. Louis Browns on the list because WAR is a compiled stat.
Correct.
So because you're the best player on the Browns, and George Sisler, who was
a good player,
was a Hall of Fame player,
yeah,
and has the all-time record for hits in the National League season with 257, which I think is pretty cool. But there's other guys that played for St. Louis. Bobby Wallace, a shortstop for Bobby Wallace, and I guess I could have put in I had Vern Stevens as one of the other shortstops.
Right.
You've mentioned him a few times, but this goes back to funny baseball, right? So he was an original St. Louis. No, he wasn't. He played for the Cardinals in 1901 when they were the Brewers, and then went to the Browns in 1902 when the Browns became the Browns.
Interesting.
He didn't leave St. Louis.
He just swapped teams.
But Bobby Wallace is is
right.
up,
But he was
there.
playing in the dead ball.
He played
era.
a bunch of years for St. Louis, and that's why he's on the all-time list.
Right.
And there's some other notable players that Bobby Grich, who we like a lot.
Right. I'm sure Palmiero.
But the thing about that, even Manny Machado, right, is on the all-time list for WAR. But these are all guys that spent part of their years in Baltimore.
Right, they were just really good while they were there.
And another guy who played every year in Baltimore except for one, who was their shortstop on the World Series winning team in 1970 and 69, Mark Belanger, a defensive wizard who hit 228 for his career at shortstop. But he is an all-time WAR guy because he got it all on D-WAR, and he played there enough times.
And he just played. I'm sure Adam Jones is on this list somewhere.
Adam Jones is on that list as well, and an excellent defensive player, in addition to being a guy who could hit home runs. So I think the Orioles need to have Adley Rutschman sort of take the moniker away from Rick Farrell.
I think they just got to have some success because they haven't won a World Series since '83. They've had scattered and limited playoff appearances since then as well. I mean, I can remember them making a postseason appearance here and there, but it's like 1 year and then they don't go back for years after that. At least that's how it feels.
Right. They had those good teams in the late 90s, right? When Miguel Tejada was there.
And they had some decent teams in the early 2010s, if I remember correctly, but it was only like a year or two where they were really like a threat.
And then I think you mentioned they have the record of futility.
Right. Interestingly, even though the Orioles have been really good and they got off to a really good start as a franchise, I want to say in 1 year in the 80s, I don't remember which year in particular, they were the first team to ever start off 0-21.
I remember that losing streak. Every day you'd look and think, wow, they lost again. They got to win tomorrow. And start a season 0-21.
And they end up playing decent baseball the rest of the way because they're not like an all-time terrible team. But that just going 0-21 to start the season, it's the same way where if you went 21-0 to start the season, if you played 500 baseball the rest of the way, you're like 100-something win team.
Right. So there's a reason why they did
Yeah.
it. So and you mentioned Adam Jones before, and Gold Gloves, home runs or whatnot. The Orioles don't have a lot of retired numbers. So Jim Palmer, Eddie Murray. Alomar's not. Brooks and Frank and Earl Weaver. I think those are the guys.
That's only 5.
That's it. And that's kind of interesting that they don't have
I think that's just a franchise choice.
So Adam Jones, who played there more than he did any place, would he be the kind of guy you might retire his number?
Maybe.
Yeah, I think they love him enough in Baltimore. Right. So, it just feels like there's room for more guys.
Right. There's guys you certainly could have retired the number for.
It doesn't necessarily mean he's in their Hall of Fame, but he should be. I think in that respect. Maybe not. Maybe Hall of Fame and not retired number. You can
right. Because it's one thing to put him in the Hall of Fame. It's another thing to say nobody else is going to wear this number for us.
Right. I think Mussina would be in the Oriole Hall of Fame, but he wouldn't necessarily have his number retired. So I think that's that's a good way of looking at it. So yeah, I think the Orioles, fortunately for we Met fans, they're 3 years earlier than the Mets for not having won their last World Series. So at least
right.
They're longer than the Mets. There aren't that many teams left that haven't.
No, I think the scary thing is based off of the way they're playing this year, they're a lot closer.
They're way closer than the Mets.